1969, Ian McHarg laid out a new approach to land planning. His seminal work, Design with Nature, blazed a new trail for sustainable urban development. The road was paved with good intentions, but it had some unintended consequences. I'm Megan Stromberg, executive editor of Planning Magazine, and I'm here today with Ignacio Bunster-Ossa. He's the author of Reconsidering Ian McHarg, The Future of Urban Ecology, published in 2014 by APA Planners Press. He's also a landscape architecture and urban design principal at WRT. That's the company founded in 1963 as WMRT, with the M standing for McHarg. Thanks for joining us today, Ignacio.
Good morning. My pleasure.
Tell us what got you started on this project. What made you decide to write the book?
Wonderful question. I think I've been working in the urban environment as an urban designer, landscape architect for most of my professional career, and there was a point in which I figured that I might as well try and get my ideas in a format that could inform myself in clearing up some thoughts and sharing it with others as to what it means to work in the urban environment and what is needed to make it, as I call it, the environment of choice.
And had you written a book before?
No, I had not written a book before. I learned a lot from it. It took me a lot longer than I thought it might, but I'm very glad I did it.
Could you summarize what the idea is behind the book? The title itself is Reconsidering Ian McHarg.
I studied under McHarg, and his methods, took us to the hinterland, basically, to understand ecology as a landscape and understanding the issues of development in that landscape, little of which had to do with urban centers. And in examining my own thoughts about how to make urban centers more attractive, especially denser, I had to, in a way, examine the education that I had received and what I could learn from this other emphasis on working more in suburban situations than in urban situations, and hence the reconsideration of that education and those teachings in the context of the problems of the day, which I think are much more urban in focus than they used to be.
Because he saw going out and living with nature in a compatible, sensitive way to nature as the ideal.
Yes.
And in your book, you posit that we can't do that anymore, and in fact, we need to become denser and more urban. Well,
I think the United Nations finally agreed a couple of years ago that humanity in this day and age is an urban. We live in cities. Most people in the world live in cities. Certainly, that's the case in this country. And so therefore it poses that as an imperative, meaning, okay, if that's who we are, and I kind of in jest say in the book that we should be called Homo urbis instead of sapiens because of that condition, then we really need to pay attention to what is that environment that we live in, what is our nature in a way, and it's not the kind of wildlife, pristine imagination that we have of nature, as I think McHarg tend to inculcate.
And pristine nature also being far away nature.
Yes, that's correct. We have in this country a system of national parks and that are beautiful and are way out there. And I think it exists. That kind of ideal exists in the American consciousness. And I think it drives the desire for so many people to try and live as close as you can to that in the form of single-family homes or estates or something like that. And it's a legitimate desire, but it flies in the face of where the world is going. So in part, what I was trying to say in the book is let's look at this other world, the real world we live in, and examine ways in which and make it healthier, sustainable, and desirable.
The subtitle of the book is The Future of Urban Ecology. Tell me what urban ecology means.
It's part of the same story that the ecology that McHarg taught, which I think, by the way, is essential in any education at any level, was the ecology of that more faraway landscape of aquifers and and flora and fauna and soil conditions, hydrology, that you can well study when you're exposed to this matrix of a natural landscape. But if we call the urban environment the quote nature that we live in, then there has to be a different way to examine ecology in that context. And I think it's an ecology that involves the predilections of people, of culture, of their ideas about the world, and so it's a different matrix of concerns, I think.
And you look at three things specifically as important to ecology. Three ideas that underpin this whole notion that you're talking about in the book.
Yes, I think that in this urban ecology, the three things that I mentioned. The first one, in no particular order of importance, but it is green infrastructure, what I call a working nature, and how the intervening in this environment requires a kind of support from systems that are, trees, water systems, dealing with air quality through landscape. And when you consider that in any city, 50% of the space is open space, and that doesn't even include rooftops, then it's a huge proportion of space in cities that can be fitted with a kind of working nature that has a direct impact on the quality of life that we all want to have. So that's number one. Number two is understanding that in any cities are not amorphous entities or abstract entities. They have very concrete sets of people, communities. Each neighborhood is different. Each district is different. The histories of neighborhoods and communities require an engagement of those kinds of conditions. And that's part of an ecology as well, understanding the definition of place, which is something that McHarg taught. We just have to apply it to the cultural matrix of cities. And then the one that is probably strangest to include is public art. Because if we think that culture plays a part in an urban ecology, then the people that can best understand and work and intervene in the cultural environment to make it, if you will, poetic or meaningful in ways that are beyond simply good design, then art plays a big role in that. And that's what I try to combine in kind of a fusion of those three things to say that those are elements of an urban ecology that needs to be understood and applied in urban design and landscape architecture.
And McHarg might not necessarily agree with you on that last part. He was not a big fan of public art. What did he think of it?
He was not. He never called it public art. He was not a fan of artists that intervene gratuitously in an ecological setting. I dearly wish that he had lived long enough to be able to have this conversation with him today, because he would probably recognize that there's more to design than simply the rigorous interpretation of ecology as he taught it. But of course he's not here, so we cannot guess what he would have said, but he wasn't particularly friend of artists and the way they think.
Do you have an idea of what he would say about other aspects of the book, sort of particularly trying to make denser urban places where people want to be, and making nature work in those areas?
I suspect he would understand today that the issues of energy usage in transportation, auto dependency, the use of land in sprawl are not good things, and he would have changed his mind. But I think I also need to mention that one of his star students, and in fact the person that succeeded him as chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at Penn, was Anne Spirn. And Anne, of course, wrote the seminal book, The Granite Garden, which begins to really look at urban conditions in a way that support McHarg's thinking. So Anne, I think, is a huge figure in this quest to make cities livable. And I think she deserves a lot of, I guess, plaudits and commendations for having initiated this whole line of thinking.
Philadelphia is an interesting place. It's where WRT is, it's where Penn is, where Ian McHarg and you taught and studied. But it's also interesting. It's an interesting place to look at in terms of what you're talking about. sort of making cities more livable. Tell us what's going on in Philadelphia.
Well, Philadelphia is undergoing kind of a renaissance of sorts. There's been a major shift in the economic base of the city in the past 25 years, with more emphasis on education, medical institutions, the arts for sure. And that has drawn kind of the millennials to really begin to own the city and transform it in very creative kinds of ways. But the city, because of its age, has the infrastructure in terms of roadways and streets that are very narrow. You can really easily walk the city. They've made strides in active mobility through trails and greenways, and there's a very aggressive green infrastructure program that is led by the Water Department to really introduce greenery that's performative as a working nature, as I call it, into every crevice and crack in the city. So it's a long-term process, but overall I think the city is much healthier today than it used to be. Certainly when McHarg was writing about it in his book, which he referred to the center of the city as one of the most unhealthy places anywhere in the region, and of course that has changed.
Well, and designers and planners and landscape architects certainly, and engineers certainly have a role in crafting that green infrastructure plan that you mentioned.
Yes.
What's the role of government in that? Continuing with Philadelphia,
I
maybe
think
as an example.
It's a very, very substantial role. I mean, the Mayor Nutter, who won't be running again for the next term, really instituted the Office of Sustainability in the city. I think supported new planning initiatives, new park initiatives, and certainly the Water Department's initiative to really transform the urban watershed into a greener place. And specifically, there are measures that require development to meet certain standards. I think the biggest one of them all is the way that water is, how you pay for water. It's not from the tap, but it's from the water your site releases into waterways and the urban environment and the combined sewers. So the more you can incentivize developers and people that have properties already to avoid the release of water from their sites by green infrastructure means, saves them money and achieves the greater kind of societal good of clean water and clean air. So that's an incentive that government provides.
One of the things you also talk about in the book is different disciplines working together, which is common. It's common that architects and planners and landscape architects would work together on various projects, but you suggest that it could be better. How could it be better? How could we help those disciplines become more, as you say, transdisciplinary, intradisciplinary rather than multidisciplinary?
Yes, that's a good question. I think that when McHarg and Wallace started the firm, and then Bill Roberts and Tom Todd came on board, and subsequently a number of different people with different disciplines, the idea was that urban problems are very complex systems to intervene in, and requires different disciplines to address them all. What happens, I think, a lot of times is that clients will require an architect to come on board, will require a landscape architect to come on board, and they may come from different places, different backgrounds, different educational foundations, and not all of them will be on the same page in terms of what is the greater project here, which is a sustainable agenda. And so I think having a common base at the educational level that all of the professional organizations support would be more in keeping with the idea that you can bring disciplines to focus on problems with the same kind of emphasis.
And how would that? How do you think that would go over with those professional groups? It's
difficult. I don't think you're going to disband the AIA or the APA or the ASLA and create one big group out of that. That won't happen. But I think that if there was some understanding, and I think the answer is an ecological ethic. If an ecological ethic were taught at the school level and then became the criteria by which these organizations promote membership and registrations and coursework, it would be getting closer to the idea that there's a common thought behind what the problem is and how to solve it.
I want to return to the idea of those three strands that underpin your argument, localism, public art, and green infrastructure. Can you think of some places that do that well? There's a few in the book that really make these poetic linkages with the place that's there now and sort of the geological or other history of the place. Right. Washington, D.C.'s National Mall is one you mentioned. Right. What other places do that really well?
I think there are initiatives that do that well, projects that are trying to do this. I think of Dallas, and they have a project that's very ambitious called the Trinity River Corridor Project, which takes a historic floodway, which used to be a beautiful floodplain with all of the ecological benefits that you can imagine of meandering river in the middle of the city, really in the middle of the city. It's a very urban place. But then it was levied, it was manhandled, if you will, by the Army Corps of Engineers, and it lost that kind of ecological value, and the city has been trying to recover that. And they're trying to do it also to spur development that is more environmentally connected to the river, and certainly to lead processes of certification, and through alternatives to automobile, promoting transit, so you get that sustainable equation there. And the project includes public art as part of the amenity package that would make this a unique kind of place. Very difficult project to implement. There's too many moving pieces, very expensive, but I think it's a game changer for the city of Dallas. So, and they're trying, so credit to them.
That Dallas project has residential components, commercial properties. It is, in a way, really hopes to re-densify Dallas,
that's
doesn't
correct.
it?
Yes. It's a huge catalyst, the project is. And I think that's one of the great values of public space in this day and age, in urban areas, towards achieving a denser environment, is what is the amenity of public space and how it can be used as a catalyst to bring about the coalescence of communities around transit facilities, around green space, around parks and greenways, in a way that makes them desirable, truly a matter of desirable choice.
And what are the things that planners and other designers should be doing to make those urban places more wonderful, more attractive to people?
Well, it's an interesting question. What I see so many times, for example, let's say that someone wants to craft a plan for a 100-acre site in a city, a redevelopment plan. The typical reaction is to, well, we need a street pattern. So you draw a street pattern, and then that gives you a sense of how much buildable space there is. You apply some floor area ratios to that, and you say mixed use, and everybody seems to walk away happy. The developers do their performance, and they can figure out how much money they're going to make. But at that point of figuring that out, almost never you get a sense at the same time, wait a minute, how much public space does this mean? And what do you do with that public space in a way that is really, you leverage green infrastructure and the fusion of public art and working with the local communities to do that. And I can tell you that rarely you find developers or planners that will calculate at the outset how much space you need to really, for example, control stormwater in a green way. It's more than the typical right-of-way, and that's a penalty, right? But at the same time, it's an incentive. So you have to work on that fine line between how much, what does it do, and what's the economic benefit at the outset. And that, I think, is not that common.
Is there a calculation for public space and amenities that are needed in?
There are numbers, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the City Parks Alliance or the Trust for Public Land, they have metrics that suggest how much space communities should have and how to use it. But that's not that common. I mean, a few people actually, could rattle off what that formula is. I don't have it in my head right now, which is part of the problem, right?
Well, we'll forgive you. Fine.
But they do exist.
Well, I thank you so much for spending time with us today and talking about your book. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, Ignacio Bunster-Ossa is the author of Reconsidering Ian McHarg, The Future of Urban Ecology. It was published in 2014 by APA Planners Press and is available at planning.org.